Good morning to everyone who is joining us on this very special day. We are honored to have you here to share the main findings of our most recent report, Navigating the Waters of Peace, Progress, Challenges, and Opportunities in the 8th Year of Implementation. My name is Josefina Chavarria, and I am the Director of the Peace Accords Matrix at the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame. Before we begin, we want to express our deep solidarity with Colombian society. The attack against Senator Miguel Uribe Turbay, as well as the assaults perpetrated this week against civilians in the departments of Valle del Cauca and Cauca, which left at least 20 people injured and resulted in the killing of 3 police officers, add to a painful and regrettably long list of violent acts against human rights defenders, social leaders, and signatories of the Colombian Peace Accord. These events, far from signaling the failure of the accord, highlight even more clearly the urgency of its comprehensive implementation. In fact, the role that violence has historically played in the political sphere was recognized in the Peace Accord as one of the key factors that generated and fueled Colombia's armed conflict. For that reason, the accord includes several measures aimed at eradicating the violence that has bled our democracy for decades. More than resources, institutions, or regulation, what this moment demands is a political class that takes on the responsibility of building peace and active citizens that demand it with conviction. In this context, we believe that today is a crucial moment to provide this update on the implementation of the 2016 Colombian Final Peace Accord. This launch is possible thanks to the collective work of a committed team, which today is represented by Ángela Ramírez, Nicolás Rojas, Ivonne Zúñiga, Alejandro Roballo, Natalia Restrepo Ortiz, Jaime Márquez, and Alison Kilhold. The Kroc Institute, part of the Keough School of Global Affairs, is an international center for peace-building research and education. It houses the Peace Accords Matrix program, PAM, the most comprehensive database on the implementation of peace agreements in the world, with information on 42 comprehensive peace accords and 236 partial accords negotiated since 1989. Since 2016, at the request of the government of Colombia and the former FARC-EP guerrillas, the signatory parties of the final agreement, the Kroc Institute took on the task of rigorously and technically monitoring its implementation in real time. Today, I am pleased to share with you the result of that work. This is the 9th annual report that we publish, and it represents not only a technical exercise, but also a tool for dialogue, an opportunity to reflect on what remains to be done, and a motivation to continue moving forward. We are confident that this exercise will contribute to sustaining hope, promoting decisive action, and strengthening the bonds that make it possible to build peace, step by step and collectively. Thank you for joining us. Now, let me share with all of you how we have structured this presentation. In the next 90 minutes or so, we want to provide you with an overview of the current status of implementation, accompanied by some key data and reflections that you will be able to explore in greater depth in the full report, which is already available online on our website, peaceaccords.nd.edu. In what follows, first, we will address the context of implementation and the general findings of the report. We will then move on to discuss the results of the international comparative analysis, which this time focuses on the timelines of the peace agreements, their level of compliance, and the extension to those implementation deadlines. After going through international analysis, we will address the Colombian case and present to you the state of overall implementation from a quantitative perspective. We will then go in depth on the gender and ethnic approaches and on territorial implementation. After this, we will present the main findings of for each of the points of the final accord. And lastly, we will present to you the opportunities we identified to boost the implementation of the final accord. After concluding this presentation, we will give the floor to the questions that the audience sent previously and to those that will be formulated in the course of this launch. For this, you can make use of the Q&A chat function on your Zoom screens. Without further ado, let's begin this presentation. I would like to ask Nicolas Rojas to please tell us about the period of analysis of the report, the context in which the implementation took place in 2024, and the general findings of the report. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Josefina, for the question. Well, as in previous reports, the Kroc Institute includes a context section that outlines key political, social, and economic factors in Colombia that influence the implementation of the final peace accord. This time, three main trends were identified. First, the report highlights that the total peace policy faced serious challenges during the analysis period. Three negotiation tables were active, but all experienced internal crises. These crises led to fragmentation within armed groups and the emergence of new dissident factions, increasing violence and worsening security in areas vital to implementing the peace accord. Some local dialogues process in Medellin, Buenaventura, and Quibdó had positive effects, such as reduced violence. Second, the report addresses international concerns and government efforts to advance the peace accords implementation. The UN Security Council continued its quarterly review of the peace accord's progress, with both signatory parts participating since July. International organizations such as the United Nations, the Inter American Commissions on Human Rights, and the Organization of American States emphasized key challenges on implementation, improving institutional coordination, passing peace related legislation, and applying differential approaches. In response, the Colombian government launched an emergency plan with six areas aimed at making progress before the end of its term. However, the plan faced criticism for lacking measurable indicators and for excluding critical issues such as victims' rights and the reintegration of ex combatants. Third, ongoing armed conflicts continue to affect key regions for peace building. In 2024, 71% of municipalities were under early warning due to the presence and expansion of armed groups, according to the Ombudsman Office. This created a serious humanitarian crisis, especially in areas such as Catatumbo, northern Cauca, or San Juan in Chocó. Also, according to the Ombudsman Office, there were 105 mass displacement events and 75 cases of confinement. While these figures were slightly lower than in 2023, they remain alarming. In the past, reported 76 massacres with 267 victims, also a decrease from the previous year, but still deeply troubling. Other crimes, including extortion and forced recruitment, increased. At least 409 children and adolescents were affected by forced recruitment. These figures underscore that the humanitarian situation remains a major obstacle to fully implementing the peace accord. Now, in this report, the Kroc Institute identified three general findings that defined the state of implementation in 2024. First, institutions focused their efforts on overcoming delays from previous years, which is necessary for increasing implementation levels. These efforts, although They did not reverse the overall quantitative trend of implementation, did strengthen the enabling environment for advancing stalled commitments. Second, the government promoted public policies to support the implementation of the final accord. However, the lack of cohesive leadership weakened the interagency coordination necessary to ensure its effective execution. And finally, implementing entities faced challenges in advancing commitments essential for national reconciliation and peaceful coexistence. While the Peace Accord aims to foster reconciliation, certain commitments are more directly related to rebuild trust, promoting respect, and enabling peaceful coexistence. The lack of progress on these commitments limited the possibility of directing overall implementation efforts to meet these aims. This finding is particularly relevant in light of the country's current situation, as Josefina mentioned before. The events that took place over the weekend clearly highlight the ongoing challenges in terms of reconciliation. Challenges that will be addressed throughout this presentation. With that, I will conclude the presentation of these sections of the report, Josefina.
Thank you very much for this explanation, Nicolas, because you have allowed us to situate ourselves contextually in the eighth year of implementation and clearly demarcated these main findings of the report. Now, I would like to move on to talk about what the Kroc Institute found regarding the international comparative experience and also about the state of implementation of the overall accord from a quantitative point of view. And for that, I would like to invite Alison Kielholt to share her findings with us.
Thank you, Josefina. As we are halfway through the 15-year timeline for implementation of Colombia's Peace Accord, I would like to touch on the topic of delays and extensions in peace processes. Last year, President Pedro proposed extending the implementation period by 7 years to the UN Security Council. The Colombian Congress also announced its support for a bill to extend the Peace Accord's timeline from 2031 to 2038. In addition, the National Planning Department updated its framework plan for implementation, which I will from now on refer to as PMI. And of the 121 current adjusted indicators, 74% saw their completion dates extended. So this effectively formalizes a longer implementation period for many key commitments. These proposals and extensions have sparked considerable debate. On one side, some argue that peace building is inherently a long-term process, requiring more time to overcome complex implementation challenges. On the other hand, a possible extension is perceived by some as a sign of failure. When we examine the international cases of the 34 comprehensive peace accords in the Peace Accords Matrix, 71%, or 24 agreements, include a detailed implementation timeline provision. Of these 24 agreements that contain this provision, 92% actually began its implementation and 53% completed it. The most recurring theme in this timeline provision is disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration, which is present in 83% of agreements. Electoral commitments also frequently included a timeline provision. As in other accords, Colombia included a detailed timeline for the laying down of arms and disarmament, which has been fulfilled. But what really stands out about the 2016 final accord is the PMI, which establishes a more comprehensive and detailed timeline for the entirety of the agreement. And if we can go to the next slide, just to show a few case studies looking internationally, we can see that delays in implementing peace agreements are common, often leading to formal timeline extension. 89% of agreements monitored by the Peace Accords Matrix experienced delays. And so I'm just going to give a few examples of some case studies we looked at. In Guatemala, the 1996 peace agreement established a 4-year timeline to implement the entire agreement. Eventually, an extension was requested, and this pushed the deadline back to 2004. Yet by 2007, many commitments still remained unfulfilled. In El Salvador, the 1992 Chapultepec Peace Accords also experienced delays from the beginning. The UN mission did intervene, and this led to new timelines in 1993, 1994, and 1995. Despite these extensions, some commitments on security, judicial reforms, and land redistribution remained unfulfilled. And finally, in the case of Northern Ireland, the 1998 Good Friday Agreement set deadlines for referendums, disarmament, and reforms. While the referendums were executed on time, disarmament took 5 years longer than planned, and police and judicial reforms also faced significant delays in formal extensions as well. Subsequent agreements like St. Andrews in 2006 and Fresh Start in 2015 were necessary to consolidate implementation efforts. So in conclusion, international comparative experience suggests that delays are a common aspect of peace agreement implementation, often caused by issues like resource availability, political will, and administrative capacity. These delays frequently entail formal timeline extensions. And while delays do mean that original deadlines were not met, extensions show an adaptable and ongoing commitment to peace building, allowing actors to set more realistic goals and ideally achieve higher levels of implementation. Now that I touched on the comparative international part of this presentation, I would like to provide further comments on the general state of implementation of Colombia's final accord. So as you can see in the graph, as of November 2024, 34% of commitments have been completed, while 19% are in an intermediate stage. However, 38% lack minimal are at the minimal progress level, and 9% have not yet begun. So this means that almost half, 47%, lack the necessary evidence to ensure completion within the stipulated timeframe. While we have seen an increase over the years in completed provisions and a significant reduction in those not yet initiated, the number of stipulations at the minimum level of implementation has remained high throughout the years. And this indicates that there has to be specific actions promoted in these areas of already initiated commitments. Some examples of that would be to advance the implementation of the comprehensive national program for the substitution of illicit crops, as well as drive progress in comprehensive rural reform. The progress made during this monitoring period is due to a combination of factors. In the regulatory sphere, the adoption of key decrees and laws has been fundamental. Institutionally, improved coordination between entities and the implementation of new dialogue mechanisms have enabled progress as well. And finally, in terms of planning, the PMI indicator review and the first territorial session held in Putumayo contributed to better monitoring coordination and increased stakeholder participation.
Regarding the status of implementation by point, the following trends can be observed. First, points 3 and 6 continue to show the highest levels of implementation, while points 1, 2, and 4 show the lowest levels. Point 5, however, is in line with the overall status of implementation as seen in the previous graph. Second, although point 2 remains one of the points with the lowest levels of implementation, it has shown the most significant changes in the last year of monitoring. During this time, uninitiated commitments fell from 34% to 22%, while provisions in minimal status increased from 34% to 45%. In summary, there has been notable progress in reducing uninitiated stipulations. However, the main challenge lies in accelerating the transition from minimum and intermediate levels to complete implementation. This underscores that the implementation of the final accord is a complex process that requires sustained effort, a comprehensive approach, and attention to disparities, such as those that will be touched upon in the next section regarding the transversal approaches. I thank you for your attention and invite you to consult the full Kroc Institute report for a more detailed analysis.
Thank you very much, Alison. For us, it is really fundamental to show the quantitative status of the implementation process by using data-based evidence, and thanks to your analysis, we can make sense of those numbers. Having addressed the general panorama, I would like to give the floor to Yvonne to address the status of the implementation of both the gender and the ethnic transversal approaches.
Thank you, Josefina. Before I begin, I want to remind our audience that since last year, we have been incorporating approaches across the analysis of all points of the peace agreement. For this reason, this specific section for the approaches focus on analyzing only the general trends in implementing gender and ethnic commitments. Regarding the quantitative analysis of the gender approach, we like to highlight that there were changes at all levels of implementation. The most significant percentage-wise was in no initiating and intermediate states. These changes were due to incorporating actions to strengthen women's participation in the decree draft that regulates the national planning system. Also, the percentage of women in the reincorporation process who were linked to an individual or collective productive project reached 95%. However, as the graph shows, there is a persisting gap in the general implementation and the gender approach, especially in the minimum and complete levels. On the other hand, the ethnic approach continues to face significant challenge. While we didn't know register setbacks, quantitative changes have not occurred in the last 2 years. Of the 80 relay provisions, 13 have not yet been initiated, and 60% are at the minimum level of implementation. Only the 13% have been fully implemented. This reflects a persistent gap compared to the overall progress of the peace agreement, especially at the minimum and complete levels of implementation. The leading causes for these levels of implementation include delays in prior consultation rights, lack of effective implementation at the territorial levels, and limited technical and financial resources to support the ethnic approach. Now, regarding to the trends in the gender approach, in this presentation, I will focus on 3 of the 5 included in the report. First, we documented that guarantees for the full participation of women and LGBTQ mass communities continue to present challenges. This is mainly because the principle of gender parity did not materialize, especially at the territorial level. For example, in the special consultation mechanism of the development programs with territorial focus, and because security risks continue to represent a constraint to the full participation of women and LGBTQ communities. The second trend was the impulse of coordination initiatives to incorporate and materialize the gender approach. Among them, we highlight the Juntanza por la Implementación del Acuerdo de Paz para Mujeres within the framework of the High Government Gender Forum, which aim to promote the commitments with gender approach that have been lagging behind. Also, we know the consolidation of the program of demonstrative experience of the integral implementation of the peace agreement for women in rural areas, which seeks to promote the integral implementation of the provisions with gender approach in rural areas. Also, during the last year, the government promoted and adopted instruments that, although were not in the peace agreement, could promote the commitments established therein. We especially highlight the National Action Plan of the Resolution 1325 and the National Care Policy. Given that both instruments contain actions that respond to specific commitments in the peace accord, in this report we made a call for the entities to articulate these actions with the gender measures of the final accord, so there is a better use of resources and a greater impact on women's lives. In the case of the ethnic approach, I will mention 3 main implementation trends in 2024. First, there were institutional efforts to implement plans and programs with ethnic approach, but these efforts were not enough. However, the Kroc Institute documented significant qualitative actions related to the ethnic approach across all points of the peace agreement. For example, under point 1 for rural reforms, land was allocated to indigenous and Afro-Colombian communities, even surpassing the formalization goals for the last year. Meanwhile, Romani communities still lack of the legal framework to access to land. Also, the development programs with territorial focus promote ethnic communities' participation, but persist the gap between ethnic and no-ethnic initiatives. The second trend involves persistent obstacles to ensure effective participation for the ethnic communities, except in the efforts led by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and the Unit for the Search of Disappeared Persons. Although the ethnic chapters require their involvement in all decision-making mechanisms, these participations have been limited in practice. For example, crop substitution mechanisms did not adopt actions to include them, and limit technical capacity at the local level continues to be a barrier to participation in territorial committees. However, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and the Search Unit made significant progress in recognizing ethnic victims. For example, the Special Jurisdiction acknowledged children for the Motilombari community as victims of forced recruitment and accredited victims of indigenous and Afro-descendant communities in essential cases. And the Search Unit prioritized actions in ethnic territories and respect cultural practice during the return on human remains. Finally, the inclusion of ethnic approach with gender, family, and generational perspective remains a significant gap. Of the 47 provisions that combine ethnic and gender approach, only 17% have been fully implemented. Many key initiatives have now begun, such as strengthening social organization or launching anti-discrimination campaigns. The National Human Rights Plan shows only a 0.34% of progress related to this specific community population. Then, 8 years after signing the peace agreement, the implementation of the ethnic approach continued to face structural gaps. While some progress has been made, achieving inclusive peace still demands adequate resources to ensure real participation and dignity for all Colombia's ethnic communities. I will leave in here. Thank you very much, Josefina.
Yvonne, thank you so much for sharing with us the report's perspective on gender and ethnic approaches. We hope that this will be helpful in providing clarity to our audience on the status of the transversal approaches and on these major implementation patterns that we have identified. Now, I would like us to take a step further and talk about another one of the Accord's big bets, the territorial implementation. That is the implementation process taking place in rural regions in Colombia. Angela, could you please tell us what were those trends that the Kroc Institute identified regarding the commitments to be implemented at the territorial level?
Yes, of course, Josefina. Before I answer your question, I just want to quickly remind the audience that since June 2022, the Kroc Institute has been implementing the Regional Barometer strategy. This initiative monitors key commitments from the final accord, those with the biggest impact in the territories, to actually see how they are being implemented on the ground. Thanks to the hard work of our team in the regions, today we're able to share with you 4 important trends in how things are going with the territorial implementation. The first trend that we identified is that we see how many of the security and protection measures in the accord haven't been effective in reducing risk in the territories. In fact, in areas like Catatumbo, Arauca, Bajo Cauca, and Chocó, violence and armed conflict continue. The Ombudsman Office issued 26 early warnings, with 8 of those identifying risk in 50 PEDET municipalities. And perhaps here I should explain to our audience that the PEDET municipalities are those in Colombia that are prioritized under development programs with a territorial focus. These programs were created by the 2016 Peace Agreement to address the structural causes of the armed conflict in the country's most affected regions. Going back to the first trend, we also documented that between January and November of 2024, 166 human rights defenders were killed, Nearly half of those murders happen in the PED municipalities. On top of that, the territorial warnings committees for rapid response are still struggling with technical and methodological weakness. The second trend that I would like to share regards the participatory bodies, like the territorial planning councils, the peace and reconciliation and consistent councils. Those are still facing challenges. In our analysis of a sample of these bodies from across 8 PEDET subregions, we found issues such as delays in achieving gender parity, uneven budget allocation, limited technical support, and outdated action plans. These limitations reduce their ability to meaningfully influence local development and peace-building efforts. Third, the institutions that are part of the comprehensive system for peace are making progress in implementing their mandates in the regions, but not everything is moving forward as it should. For example, we took a look at 10 regional search plans led by the search unit of persons deemed as missing and found that while 70% are already being implemented, 30 are still in the formulation stage. The special jurisdiction has also been active, issuing precautionary measures to protect 13 forensic sites in places like Urabá, Alto Patía, Norte del Cauca, Sierra Nevada, Perijá, and Pacífico Medio. But even with these efforts, institutional coordination continues to be a major hurdle. When it comes to collective reparations, we're seeing serious gaps. The comprehensive collective reparation plans haven't advanced as they should. Often, urgent humanitarian needs are prioritized over the reparations, and coordination between institutions remains weak. Finally, our fourth trend is about the 2024-2027 territorial development plans in the PED regions. According to our monitoring, these plans have made room for peace-related content. 94% included some kind of chapter, program, or policy focused on peace. That's encouraging, but when we look more closely, of the 35 topics we prioritized, we found that only 49% of the topics were actually reflected in the programmatic sections. Even more concerning, there's often a disconnect between what's planned and what's actually budgeted. This imbalance could limit the comprehensive implementation of peace accord envisioned for these regions. To wrap up, I want to invite everyone to take a look at the sections of our report that cover territorial implementation for each point of the accord. There you'll find much more detail about what's happening and what still needs to happen in the PED subregions. Thank you, Josefina.
Thank you so much, Angela, for this balance that allows us to identify how the accord was implemented at the territorial level, particularly in the regions, as you say, with the territorial development plans or PED. Now, to better understand this overall picture, I want to invite many of our members of the team here today to tell us about the implementation of each of the points or chapter of the accord and how it has progressed, the challenges that it has been facing. And I want to start with Jaime. To present, Jaime, please, both point 1 on integral rural reform and point 4 on ending the problem of illicit drugs.
Thank you, Josefina. Well, regarding point 1 on comprehensive rural reform, during the last year of implementation, the Kroc Institute observed an institutional restructuring process that, even though it promotes new regulatory and operational strategies, faced delays in the effective implementation. As November 2024, 3% of the provision under point 1 had not yet been initiated. 70% remain at the minimal level of implementation, and 18% were at an intermediate stage, and only 9% had been complete. This demonstrates that 73% of the comprehensive rural reform commitments lack evidence regarding their feasibility of being fulfilled with the deadlines established in the final agreement. Additionally, the provisions in a minimal stage increased by 2 percentage points compared to the previous period, driven by the adoption of the national system for guarantee of the human right to food. With respect to the gender provision, the situation remained critical. Complete provisions decreased from 8 to 5% due to the failure to meet credit allocation target for women. In terms of the ethnic approach, as we saw before, the indicators show no changes. But for point one, we identify mainly four trends. The first trend regarding land access highlight that the land-related component has achieved normative progress. However, structural gaps remain. For example, land access measures were leveraged through the National System for Agrarian Reform, prioritizing land acquisition process in municipalities in the Caribbean and Magdalena Medio region, and the establishment of 310 municipalities agrarian reform committees over the country. This was done to engage campesino and producers organizations in the whole process of the rural reform. Another key advance was the adoption by the National Land Agency of the Manual for Land Acquisition, which clarified the land purchase process. Regarding land adjudication historical information, it was not available. Therefore, we focused on analyzing the annual adjudication report against the National Development Plan target and the comparative figure from November 2023 and 2024, according to Synergia. 4,457 hectares were adjudicated in 2024, representing only 0.5% of the 4-year target of this government. Although it should be noted that there was a 5% increase compared to November 2023. But in impeded subregions, adjudication fell by 17%, which is an a difficult situation for the Pedret region. In terms of land formalization as November 2024, 337,793 hectares had been formalized, but a 45% decrease compared to the previous year. Impeded territories formalization decreased also by 71%. Additionally, the underreporting of land formalization and adjudication in favor of women in their own name persists. We also document the approval of the statutory law creating agrarian courts. However, the ordinary law need to regulate their operation was shelved and later reintroduced with an urgent message. Its absence seriously affects the efficiency of the redistributive process established in the agreement. Lastly, in the environmental component, we observe improved coordination between the Ministries of Agriculture and Environment. Also, the environmental restrictions for creating campesino reserve zones were lifted, the agroecology policy was adopted, and regulations on the use of forest reserve were updated. Key advance to strengthen rural reform with a territorial and environmental focus. Regarding the second trend on the development programs with territorial focus, significant advance in participation were recorded over the past year. More than 20,000 people were called for the updating of the territorial action plans, although their institutional coordination during this process and the integration of a gender approach faced some challenge. Also, the Territorial Renewal Agency report that 54% of the whole initiative have been activated, with 45% either under implementation or complete. However, structural challenges persist, such as gap between pillars, subregions, and classifiers, particularly in the ethnic ones. Additionally, as a third trend, we observe the formalization strategies to boost the PDET, such as Juntos por el Territorio, Territorial Pacts for Regional Transformation, Integrate Projects, and the Plan de Choque or Action Plan. However, these strategies show fragment implementation and the need for effective multi-level governance. The fiscal sustainability remains a major concern for the PDET, with a high dependency on the national general budget and the general system of transfers. Finally, in the fourth trend analyzed, the Kroc Institute assessed the 6 plans overseen by the agriculture sector. We identify progress in regulatory and planning matters that consolidate institutional foundations for fulfilling the commitments of the agreement. Nonetheless, limitations in the coordination and effective implementation at the territorial level persist. On one hand, the national plans were aligned with the National Development Plan, highlighting regulatory advances. However, 4 of the 6 plans show low implementation rates in the territories, maintaining gaps between planning, implementation, and reporting. Next, please. Thank you. Regarding point 4 on the solution of the problem of illicit drugs, significant stagnation was observed, compromising the timely fulfillment of its commitments. As November 2024, 3% of the provision had not started implementation. 48% were in minimal level, 26% had reached an intermediate level, and 23% had complete implementation. Compared to the previous period, no changes were registered. Gender-related provision present a critical situation, progressing below the general average. 11% had not started, 53% remained minimal implemented, and only 11% had been complete. All regarding the ethnic provision shows some level of progress, with no initiated. However, progress was limited to 67% at the minimum level, 17 at the intermediate level, and only 17 are complete. On this point, we observe 3 trends. The first trend relates to the comprehensive national program for substitution of illicit crops, in which operational redesign were prioritized, although critical challenge persists regarding territorial implementation and differential approaches. Although a new route for the immediate family care plan was formalized and over 57,000 investment plans were reported, key gaps were identified. For instance, specific guidelines for coca leaf picker were not included, nor was the explicit alignment with the gender protocol. Additionally, the redesign focus on the family component didn't include adjustments on the community component, the PISDA plans, or links with the comprehensive rural reform. It's noteworthy that the Constitutional Court issued 3 key rulings mandating corrections to the exclusion and guarantee differential approaches. While these operational adjustments took place, cocaine production reached historic highs, with a 53% increase according to UNODC, and 93% of municipalities with coca crop report the presence of non-state armed groups. Eradication dropped by 59% compared to the previous year, although confiscation of cocaine increased by 9.8%. The second trend we document is strategies aimed to promote licit economies. However, insecurity, weak institutional structures, and inadequate productive conditions limit their effectiveness. As a third trend, we highlight the guidelines promoted by the National Drug Policy, although the absence of an action plan affect the integration of this component with other intersectoral access. Regarding drug use prevention, the Ministry of Health lead actions with a public health approach in territories with significant Afro-descendant populations. However, the creation of the National Program of Comprehensive Intervention on Illicit Drug Use is still pending, a key mechanism for delivering structural and long-term response to drug use. Finally, important progress was made in controlling chemical substance used in narcotic production through voluntary agreements with companies that use controlled chemicals. In summary, we can see that point 1 and 4 on the final peace agreement share a common structural challenge, fragment implementation that does not translate into sustainable transformation in the territories, highlighting the need to strengthen multi-level governance. So thank you for your attention, and I would like to close by giving the floor to my colleague Alejandro Roballo, who will present the status of the implementation of the point 2 on political participation and point 6 on verification. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jaime. Point 2 continues to be one of the points with the lowest levels of implementation in the entire final agreement. As of November 2024, 22% of the stipulations under this point had not yet begun implementation, and 45% were in a minimal state. Meanwhile, 19% of the stipulations were at an intermediate level and 40% had already been fully implemented. Despite 67% of the commitments under this point still lacking the feasibility to be completed within the established timeframe, we have to say that point 2 was the point with the greatest variation in its implementation levels during 2024. In particular, there was a significant increase in stipulations in a minimal state, accompanied by a corresponding decrease in those not yet initiated. Although the gap between general implementation and the implementation of measures with differential approaches persists, there were advancements in the implementation levels of the gender approach during this year. Specifically, the proportion of stipulations not yet initiated decreased to 32%, and the stipulations in the minimal level increased to 45%. The intermediate and complete levels remain at 19% and 3% respectively. The ethnic approach, on the other hand, did not experience quantitative changes, so the implementation levels of these ethnic submetrics remain at 19% not initiated, 38% minimal, 31% intermediate, and 13% complete. The progress and challenges that point to face during the 8th year of implementation can be summarized into 3 trends. First, some legislative advances were achieved. Noteworthy here are the enactment of the law prohibiting the use of public advertising funds for promoting government branding, or the sanctioning of the law ensuring gender parity in decision-making positions across public branches of power. Despite these advances, there were also serious obstacles in moving forward with other initiatives, such as the political reform bill introduced by the national government in September, or the proposed reform to the organic law of planning. Added to this scenario are a number of legislative delays, such as the participation guarantees bill, which has never been discussed by Congress. Second, as a second trend, the national government implemented several actions to strengthen citizen participation, especially regarding participatory planning and guarantees for social protest. Within the framework, for example, of the territorial development plans, the National Planning Department disseminated several tools and documents and provided technical assistance to strengthen the participation of the territorial planning councils. Likewise, this department drafted a regulatory decree for the national planning system, explicitly including several commitments from Section 2.2.6 of the agreement. Regarding protest guarantees, the Ministry of Defense issued a decree to regulate the use of force, and the National Police deployed its dialogue teams to respond to protest events. Finally, the third notable trend is that despite all these progresses, the government faced significant challenges in consolidating public policies to advance the commitments of point 2. Specifically, the public policy on citizen participation and the social dialogue policy have experienced serious delays in their final adoption. Moreover, delays in finalizing the action plan for the public policy on reconciliation, coexistence, and non-stigmatization have further hindered its implementation. For the part of point 6 of the final agreement, this point saw changes at all levels and remains the point with the highest overall levels of implementation. As of November 2024, 5% of the stipulation under this point had not yet begun implementation, and 19% were at a minimal level, 15% at an intermediate level, and 61% of the commitments have been fully implemented. Regarding differential approaches, no significant changes were observed in the levels of implementation. In this point, 3 key trends in implementation during the year can also be highlighted. The first one is that the monitoring, verification, and educational mechanisms of the final agreement were actively functioning during this period. In particular, the CCV was more active than in previous years. Although challenges to its operation persisted, the Commission addressed major issues essential to fulfilling its mandate. In particular, a territorial session was held for the first time in the municipality of Villagarzón, and the parameters for the review of the framework plan for implementation were approved. This later action led to the framework plan being updated for the first time since its creation in 2017. As a result of this important development, 77 new indicators were included and 123 of the existing ones were adjusted. In line with this trend, it is worth noting that the National Radio and Television of Colombia launched the final 4 peace radio stations. This will enhance the dissemination of educational content about the final agreement and support the production of local information related to its implementation. The second trend on this point is that the advisory bodies to the SCCB, specifically the Special Women's Forum and the Special High-Level Forum with Ethnic Peoples, the IAMPE, received government funding for their operations for the first time. IAMPE received funds in May, allowing it to carry out its annual work plan, which included publishing a report on the state of implementation of the ethnic approach. The Special Women's Forum, however, only received its funding in October, which hindered its operation for most of 2024. Despite this, it made continuous progress in fulfilling its mandate, which also included publishing a special report on the gender approach. Finally, the third trend worth noting is that the resources allocated for the implementation of the agreement were insufficient and faced execution issues and allegations of corruption. According to the Office of the Comptroller General, the resources allocated for the agreement's implementation decreased by 21% in 2024. Additionally, the execution of these funds showed low efficiency across several key programs, such as the substitution of illicit crops. Compounding this issue, the Congress of the Republic did not approve the national government's proposed general budget or its financing law, which is expected to significantly reduce the funds available for implementation in 2025. This shortfall could impact, of course, the fulfillment of several commitments. I will close here to give the floor to my colleague, Natalia Restrepo, who will present the status of implementation of and the progress pertaining to point 3 on the end of the armed conflict and point 5 of victims.
Thanks, Alejandro. Regarding the implementation of point 3 related to the end of the armed conflict, as we can see in the graph, we find that as of November 2024, 9% of the stipulations had not begun implementation, 21% were in a minimal state, 18% were in an intermediate state, and 51% had already completed implementation. During the analysis period, point 3 presented only one quantitative change in its implementation levels, which corresponded to 2 events. One, associated with security and protection guarantees with the issuance of the resolution formalizing and regulating the Strategic Security and Protection Plan for former combatants, their families, and members of the Comunes Party, and the other related to information submitted by the Reincorporation and Normalization Agency, which indicates that more than 90% of combatants in the reincorporation process received the 8 million Colombian pesos as an economic benefit to carry out a productive or housing project. This last change was also reflected in the gender submatrix, since nearly 96% of the 3,000 women active in the reincorporation process received the 8 million pesos benefit mentioned before. The general trend of point 3 since 2016 aligns to the implementation momentum of the topics it covers. In this sense, the greatest drive of this point on the end of the armed conflict occurred during the first year of the final agreement. Of the implementation of the final agreement, following the execution of the commitments associated with the bilateral and definitive ceasefire and end to hostilities and laying down of arms. The commitments related to the political and socioeconomic reincorporation process have shown a slower but stable implementation pace. In contrast, the commitments related to security and protection guarantees, including those established in point 2, have shown a marked stagnation in their implementation, which unfortunately coincides with the increase of risk scenarios and violations against various populations. In this 8th year of implementation, although progress was made in the regulation of important instruments for the development of the reincorporation process and security and protection guarantees, such as the National Reincorporation System, the Comprehensive Reincorporation Program, the Strategic Plan for Security and Protection, and the Dismantling Public Policy, some delays and institutional lack of fulfillment led to the slowdown and postponement of their implementation. These failures were evidenced particularly in the development of indicators, goals, and budget allocation for the security instruments. Delays in the implementation of several points of the final agreement led the Ministry of Interior to present an emergency plan, which includes a special section for restructuring the security approach and the activation and revitalization of the comprehensive security system for the exercise of politics. To date, no technical document that develops the strategy or a roadmap for the restructuring and revitalization of the security component of the agreement is known. Meanwhile, the dynamics of violence continue to affect various territories, thus affecting the lives and rights of population with special protection under the final agreement, such as ethnic communities, social leaders, human rights defenders, and former combatants who face new scenarios of risk and violations due to the reconfiguration of illegal armed groups. For point 5, regarding the victims of the armed conflict, as we can see in the graph, as of November 2024, 11% of the stipulations had not yet been implemented, 28% were in a minimal state, 21% were in an intermediate state, and 40% had already been fully implemented. During 2024, Point 5 underwent changes at all levels of implementation due to several factors, including the first waiver of criminal prosecution issued by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, or HEP, interinstitutional coordination between the search unit, the victims unit, and the Ministry of Health for psychosocial care for the families of persons deemed as missing, the enactment of Law 2421, which reforms the Victims Law, and the presentation of the second follow-up report on the recommendations of the Truth Commission by the Monitoring Committee. This report also involved a change in the gender submatrix, because although it was not a specific report on the recommendations in the women and LGBTIQ+ people, it took up some of the recommendations, the gender recommendations, and incorporate several analyses with this approach. The implementation trend for point 5, as Alison mentioned before, remains like the overall implementation trend for the final agreement. Until 2018, point 5 had the highest peak in its implementation, which is related to the creation and launch of the entities that make up the Comprehensive System for Peace, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, the Search Unit, and the Truth Commission. Since then, moderate progress has been made. As for the truth component of the final agreement continues to drive changes in the implementation of point 5. As we mentioned before, the Monitoring Committee presented its second report, in which, among other things, it called for the comprehensive implementation of the final agreement. And the Search Unit, in addition to the territorialization of its mandate, continued to strengthen ties of trust with various contributors of information on missing persons. This led to the intervention of a water well in the municipality of Barranca Bermeja in Santander, and the recovery of 2 bodies at this site, something without precedence in this country, in Colombia. The justice and reparation components, on the other hand, have experienced the greatest challenges in achieving higher levels of implementation. As to the justice component, although restorative sanctions are necessary to increase levels of implementation, it cannot be ignored that the Special Jurisdiction for Peace has also made progress in other areas of its mandate, such as acknowledgement of responsibilities and adversarial proceedings. Today, the Kroc Institute wants to highlight the indictment of 6 former members of the last Secretariat of the former FARC in Case 7 related to the recruitment and use of children, as well as for other war crimes committed against them in the context of intra-rank life, including sexual, reproductive, and prejudice-based violence. The Special Jurisdiction for Peace must function as an independent and impartial court, not only in formal terms, but also in the effective exercise of its functions. However, during 2024, the Kroc Institute identified several factors that could affect the development of this mandate. In particular, we recorded some actions aimed at publicly pressuring the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, in relation to decision-making on the imposition of its restorative sanctions. We also highlighted some challenges regarding procedural guarantees for perpetrators, budgetary restrictions, and limitations in coordination with the entities responsible for enforcing these sanctions. In addition, there is a lack of coordination and correspondence between the restorative component of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and the reparation policy, which is explained not only by budgetary issues but also by a lack of political leadership. The adoption of the new regulatory framework through the reform of the Victims' Law may be an opportunity to overcome some of the delays in the implementation of the comprehensive reparation policy and its coordination with the justice component. The reform included, among other things, mechanisms for interinstitutional coordination between different entities. This is an initial overview of the implementation of the commitments on reintegration, security and protection guarantees, and victims. I would like to invite our audience to download and read our latest report to learn more about these issues. Thank you.
Hi, Alejandro and Natalia. Thank you very much for the presentation that you have shared with us today. We know how difficult it is to synthesize so much information, and I think that you have done a really great job. Despite this, I think it's important just to highlight once more what Natalia was saying, because on our report we have a lot more details. You can go into depth if you are especially interested in one of the points of the agreement or one of the approaches, but at the same time, because of the time that we have available here, we have to summarize so much that there are maybe some topics that we don't have the opportunity to discuss. So if you can go to peaceaccords.nd.edu, I'm sure that you'll find everything that you're looking for. And now I think we are only missing the last part of our presentation, and we would like to share with all of you what are the opportunities that we have identified in our last comprehensive report to overcome the different challenges that we have been discussing. And for that, I would like to give the floor to Angela.
Thank you, Josefina. The first thing that I want to highlight is that the report includes opportunity for each point of the peace agreement, as well as for the gender and ethnic cross-cutting approaches and the territorial implementation. So what I will be sharing today are the broader opportunities that the Kroc Institute has identified. So let me walk you through 7 general opportunities we have identified. The first one, we believe there's room to strengthen high-level leadership by creating a presidential advisory office for implementation. This office would not only advise the president directly, but also help coordinate key actions, ensure alignment across institutions and territories, and bring a more integrated vision to the process. The second opportunity that we have highlighted in our report is the ongoing review of the Implementation Framework Plan, or PMI. This process is being led by the Implementation Unit and the National Planning Department, and it is a great chance to go beyond just updating timelines or responsible agencies. It is also an opportunity to ensure that the indicators truly reflect the goals of the Accord, while also integrating gender and the ethnic approach. The third opportunity that we have highlighted in our report is to accelerate implementation in the territories. Coordination among institutions like the Territorial Renewal Agency, the National Land Agency, the Rural Development Agency, and local governments, especially mayors and governors at the PDET, needs to be strengthened. This effort should be aligned with broader strategies such as the collective reparation plans, the restorative system of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, and the territorial pacts. Additionally, all of these efforts need sustainable funding to avoid fragmentation and ensure long-term impact. Fourth, we see a role for the Ministry of Interior and the Implementation Unit in leading a strategy to guide budgetary and institutional priorities for the rest of this administration. This strategy should prioritize specific lines of action, foster ownership among implementing institutions, and align with the strategic process, such as the review of the implementation plan, framework plan, and the territorial transformation plans. Fifth, when it comes to gender and ethnic-based commitments, we're at a critical point, as you have been able to see during this presentation. Therefore, the Vice Presidency and the Ministry of Equality need to ensure that the progress made in these areas is sustained and strengthened. Whether that means reinforcing the Ministry of Equality or redistributing responsibilities. The key is to avoid institutional fragmentation and maintain the impact and continuity of these approaches. Six, the international community continues to be a crucial ally for the implementation process. Its technical, political, and financial support can make a real difference, especially when focused on programs that are facing the biggest delays. But that support needs to be aligned with the PMI priorities and focus on the most affected territories. Seventh, and finally, as we approach the 2026 elections, there's an urgent need to move forward in the Accord's commitments on political participation, security guarantees, and reconciliation. The Ministry of Interior, the National Civil Registry, and the National Electoral Council have key roles to play here, from consolidating the National Political Pact to strengthening the comprehensive security system for the exercise of politics and ensuring inclusive participation, especially for women, ethnic communities, and peace process organizations. Thank you, Josefina.
Thank you, Angela. Thanks for highlighting those opportunities. I would like to extend my gratitude to all the members of the team who presented today the result of the monitoring and analysis work of the last year. But my appreciation also extends to those who are part of the Barometer Initiative and the Kroc Institute, both in Colombia and in South Bend, who did not participate directly in this presentation today, but whose contributions have been essential to this collective effort. We will now begin to take questions from the audience, so you can write any questions if you want us to go deeper into one of the topics that you're interested in, or you want us to clarify something, just use the Q&A function. We have received already some questions in advance when you register for this event, so I think we're going to start with those. So let me see. Question number one. Yeah, exactly. It's great if you turn on your cameras now. So let's begin. I would like to address this question to Alejandro. What tools does the peace agreement provide to navigate the current situation in the country following the attack on Senator Miguel Uribe?
Well, Josefina, it is important to point out that what happened this weekend to Senator Uribe is a manifestation of something that has never truly ceased in our country, and that's the violence against the political and social leaders. This very issue was recognized in the peace agreement as one of the root causes and drivers of the armed conflict in our country. Consequently, several provisions in the agreement were designed to eliminate this practice. And specifically, points 2 and 3 of the agreement include a series of measures to promote democratic openness and ensure the right to political participation. At this moment in our country's history, particularly with the upcoming electoral processes next year, it is crucial to return to the roadmap already outlining in the peace agreement regarding security guarantees and guarantees for reconciliation, coexistence, and non-stigmatization. In particular, we believe it is essential to accelerate and promote the implementation of 4 key measures from points 2 and 3. The first one is the strengthening of the comprehensive security system for the exercise of politics by activating its 9 components in a coordinated and harmonious manner. These components promote prevention, protection, and security measures that ensures the freedoms and work of social leaders and organizations, the signatories of the final agreement and their families, and of course the political actors, especially those in opposition. Second, while the coordinated implementation of the system is essential, priority must be given to activating one of its components, and that's the public policy for the dismantling of criminal behaviors and organizations. This policy includes, among other elements, the dismantling of the political dimension of criminal organizations and structures that interfere with the free exercise of electoral and democratic rights. Third, the public policy on reconciliation, coexistence, and non-stigmatization must be implemented. This policy has already suffered years of delay to difficulties in consolidating its action plan that should be implemented with the support of the National Peace Council. This policy would be essential in desescalating the current polarization in the country, confronting hate speech and stigmatization, the current and creating conditions to address political differences through dialogue and institutional mechanisms. Finally, point 3 of the agreement includes the consolidation of a national political pact to remove weapons from politics. This pact was meant to commit all actors in the country to reject violence and pursue reconciliation. And at this juncture, it is crucial to revisit the roadmap previously developed by the Ministry of the Interior and the National Peace Council to convene all political and social forces in the country to reject violence and find paths towards democratic coexistence. At the Barometer Initiative, we believe that the implementation of these measures would provide viable solutions to the difficult situation we're currently facing. However, their effectiveness depends largely on a swift response from the national government to push forward and realize these actions in the coming months. Thank you, Josefina.
Thank you, Alejandro. I think all of those measures would be extremely relevant and useful for all of us right now. I think it's a very timely and necessary reminder of what is already included in the final accord that has not been implemented fully, and therefore we continue seeing a lot of those patterns of violence. Let's move on to the second question, which I would like Jaime Marquez to help us answer. And it reads like this. What are the enabling and limiting factors affecting the agrarian reform? In other words, what is needed for its implementation to move forward more quickly?
Thank you, Josefina. Well, among the enable factors, we identify the territorial approach implementing through the National System for Agrarian Reform, which advanced rural reform by addressing the regional needs and opportunities through its subsistence. Another enabling factor, despite ongoing challenge, is the use of properties held by the public institutions for rural reform purposes, such as land managed by the Special Asset Society, which is SAE in Spanish. This enabled the provision, allocation of productive land that remain unused. However, it's essential to resolve the provisional status promptly. Additionally, as I mentioned in my presentation, the new collective approach to agrarian reform is key. It prioritizes land allocation to campesino and producers organizations, which will both accelerate the productive use of land and strengthen the community-based structures to support the reform process. On the other hand, the limit factors, undoubtedly the absence of the agrarian jurisdiction is the main obstacle to accelerate the implementation of the rural reform. As we see in the previous year, the ordinary jurisdiction lacked the capacity to address all the conflict in a timely and effective manner. the diverse agrarian and territorial issues that the jurisdiction should assume, such as the formalization of private property, the recovery of public lands, we call baldeos, and the expropriation, among other issues. Another key issue that we highlight in our report is the weak coordination and integration of the point one, particularly regarding the national plans of the rural reform. Although progress has been made implementing these plans, it is essential to ensure that the programs and projects are effectively directed toward the intent beneficiaries of the agrarian reform, with the primary objective of closing the gaps between the rural and the urban areas. And that will be my answer, Josefina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you so much for your answer. We have here another very interesting question that we have received from the public, and it reads like this. And Angelita, maybe you can prepare for an answer. Where do you see the biggest challenges or weaknesses in the coordination between national, territorial, and local levels when it comes to implementation? Thank you.
Thank you, Josefina. More than 8 years after the signing of the Peace Accord, one key weakness that still persists is the lack of real ownership and implementation of the Accord's territorial approach by some actors and institutions across different governmental levels. This can be seen, for example, in the high degree of centralization in the design of public policies, programs, and projects. While these initiatives often have strong technical components, they don't always respond to the diverse realities and needs of specific regions, subregions, and the local communities. On top of that, the national government often operates in a fragmented manner. In many cases, it struggles to coordinate objectives, targets, and resources strategically with the local and regional authorities. This makes it harder to implement the measures designed to reduce violence and inequality, particularly those that aim to close the gap between rural and urban areas. There are also often factors we need to consider. For example, the limited technical and financial capacity of PEDET municipalities. Many local governments also have only a partial understanding of the Peace Accord's full scope. They tend to focus mainly on transitional justice and PEDET measures, which can leave other equally important commitments unattended. Finally, it's important to acknowledge that territorial actors have faced significant barriers to directly participating in the implementation of the agreement. These obstacles have contributed to growing frustration, fatigue, and even distrust among communities toward states' institutions. To address these challenges, it is essential for bodies like the Commission for Monitoring, Promoting, and Verifying Implementation of the Final Accord, CCV, to strengthen their presence in the territories. This means actively engaging with civil society and local governments to move implementation forward. The CCV should also have regular territorial sessions, and here it's important to note that in 8 years of implementation, it has only held one. Finally, strengthening coordination mechanisms that allow for joint investments and integrated projects is also critical to ensuring real and lasting change on the ground. Thank you, Josefina.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those insights. I have here another question, another quite a key inquiry that we have received. What elements does the Kroc Institute consider have contributed to the gap in the implementation of ethnic initiatives in territorially focused development programs? And so I would like to ask Yvonne, I think you're the perfect person for this question. Thank you.
Thank you, Josefina. So there is several reasons that explain the state of the implementation of the ethnic initiatives in the development program of point one about the rural reform. And actually the reason may vary depending on the context of each region in Colombia, but they all have in common one structural aspect, that is the lack of technical capacity to formulate ethnic-focused projects that may be eligible for funding from different sources, such as the national general budget, the royalty system, or the task for works mechanisms. Therefore, it's important to continue to strengthening ethnic organizations that could have the capacity to formulate these projects. And it is also important to promote the participation of different actors, for example, the private sector, the international cooperation, that can be a key actor to finance the initial stages of the formulation of these initiatives. Of course, with the participation of the communities involved, that guarantee that that formulation respond to the realities of the ethnic communities. Okay, thank you, Josefina.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Let me see the following question. Maybe Natalia, if you can help us answer this. Have any of the Kroc Institute's indicators shown a decline? In other words, how are you measuring, for example, forced displacement from the territorial spaces for training and reintegration, the ETCRs, for its Spanish acronym? Natalia, thank you.
Of course, Josefina. Thank you. I can help you with that question. Perhaps the first thing to clarify is that we do not measure indicators, but rather levels of implementation of stipulations. Additionally, as to the declines or setbacks, the methodology we have at the Kroc Institute allows for the possibility of setbacks in implementation levels. For example, there are some provisions related to the adoption of laws which advance in their implementation as a legislative bill goes through the corresponding process and have setbacks when the bill is shelved. This has occurred in the case of the political reform, whose stipulations have suffered setbacks when the various bills to make it effective have stalled in the Congress of the Republic here in Colombia. On the other hand, although there are no stipulations indicating that there shouldn't be any attacks against former combatants and signatories to the agreement or other populations protected by the comprehensive security system for the exercise of politics, there are stipulations that establish mechanisms to guarantee the safety and protection of these individuals. Regarding the forced displacements of the territorial spaces for training and recorporation, which are acts that undermine the reincorporation process and therefore undermine the implementation of the peace agreement, our methodology, of course, documents these events in order to understand the challenges in implementing the security guarantees provided for in point 3 of the final agreement, which is the point concerning the mechanisms to end the armed conflict. In the case of former combatants, there is a stipulation referring to the creation of a comprehensive protection program for them, their families, and members of the Communist Party, which establishes the institutional framework to guarantee the safety and protection of these individuals. The decree regulating the program was not signed until very recently, this past Tuesday night. We hope that this instrument helps overcome the absence of coordinated institutional measures to prevent risks and harm to this population. In this report, we analyze how the decrease in murders of former combatants during 2024 contrasts with the increase in threats and forced displacements, both individual and collective. So we invite you and the audience to read our report to learn more about this and other issues. Thank you, Josefina.
Thank you very much. We have here a question in the chat. I think if I may invite Yvonne to answer it, and then if Alison would also like to complement it. And let me see, it reads like this. In your presentations, the outcomes outlined under gender and ethnic approaches are quite opaque, as one cannot measure or understand the experience of racialized ethnic women under both these approaches. Okay, now do you disaggregate the data on ethnicity under gender and then gender under ethnicity? So Yvonne, if you can start helping us answer that question. Thank you very much for the question.
Josefina. The answer is yes. We have 47 provisions that share gender and ethnic approach, and our methodology measures each of these commitments, taking in account special measures like affirmative actions for this specific population. Actually, in the presentation, I mentioned it that only the 17% of these commitments have made progress. So we don't have a specific sub-matrix for gender and ethnic provisions, but we are able to see each of one of these commitments and isolate and see how it is advanced, how it progress, or how it's lagging behind in respect of the general implementation of the Peace Accord. Definitely, that is one of the approaches that was included in the ethnic chapter for the ethnic communities, the gender, generational, and ethnic approach. And there is a lot of difficulties, especially for the national entities to operationalize what means this approach in particular and include special measures for women from Afro-Colombians and indigenous communities. I will end it here. Thank you, Josefina.
Very well. Alison, do you want to add something from your perspective?
I would just say, I think they highlighted a challenge that we do face when we receive information, because we get the information from the national level and different reports. And so if from that level, it's not disaggregated by sex and gender and ethnic population, and within ethnic populations also sex and gender, then that's just information that we don't know. So one of our recommendations has always been for these reports and for the implementing entities to disaggregate this information so that that is more clear. But I think that is one of the challenges that we have experienced ourselves.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We have one time for one last question. One that we have also received in advance. And I would like to invite Nicolas to answer this one. What are the main leadership challenges in implementation identified in this report?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Josefina. Well, at the Kroc Institute, we have identified a multiplicity of leadership roles in the implementation process. A dedicated implementation unit was created within the Office of the High Commissioner for Peace. The Office of the Vice President assumed responsibilities related to the ethnic approach, and during 2024, the Ministry of Interior took a leadership in implementation matters. This dispersion of leadership increased the risk of lack of coordination among implementing entities. I would like to return to the first general opportunity that Angela mentioned earlier, the need to reestablish the Presidential Advisory Office to coordinate the implementation of the Peace Accord. In doing so, coordination tasks could be concentrated within a high level entity capable of channeling efforts to strengthen implementation of the Peace Accord. At the Kroc Institute, we have documented how different sectors have expressed the need to reestablish this figure. Even the communist component of the CCV has raised alerts regarding this necessity. Strengthening leadership is fundamental to advancing the principle of comprehensiveness, which is essential for implementing the Peace Accord properly. Comprehensive implementation requires complex actions to be carried out through the coordinated efforts of implementing entities. These are some key points I wanted to highlight in response to this question, Josefina. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna use the absolute last minutes we have, because I think we had one that I think is quite a good question still saved for the last minute. Alison, if you can help us answer this succinctly, is there a difference between the methodology used for national versus territorial monitoring? Thank you.
Yes, so the territorial methodology follows the same system that our national one does in terms of the 0 to 3 scale of not initiated to completed implementation, but there are a few differences. So the number of stipulations at the The national level is 578, whereas at the territorial monitoring, we focus on 32 stipulations that were selected specifically based on their intended impact in the territories. And then another main difference is that in our territorial monitoring, everything is divided into 16 subregions. And so instead of having one set of coding rules for everything, they are tailored to the specific subregions, and this will allow us to have a comparative analysis at the territorial level in terms of implementation. So those are the two main differences.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. Thank you, everyone, for your answers and for your presentations. And thank you also to our audience for joining us in this event. I would like now to close this presentation by inviting everyone who's listening to this recording or who is reading our reports to understand that, of course, the monitoring report that we have is not just a tool that offers factual information, but we also want it to be an inspiration for everyone to serve as a tool for actions for peace and to reject passivity, to instead keep up the conviction that peace and the peaceful settlements of disputes is the only path that offers a future for Colombia. To the victims in all the Colombian regions who continue to resist with dignity the effects of the armed conflict, we extend our profound solidarity. We also stand in solidarity with our stakeholders who, from different territories and in a variety of roles and positions, dedicate their lives to the construction of peace, such as social leaders, marginalized communities, community officials, civil society organizations that engage in collective processes that day after day sustain the hope of a national reconciliation with social justice. In the Kroc Institute, you will always find an ally. Your persistence, courage, and commitment sustain our conviction that peace, especially in uncertain times, is a real possibility built by all of us as a collective. Echoing the words of Jean-Paul Lederach, more than a distant goal, peace is a way of inhabiting our daily relationships with dignity, respect, and empathy. And we subscribe to that every day that we work for peace in Colombia. May this report remind us that this horizon is not built by a single gesture, but by persistent steps, sustained bonds, and shared commitments. Our report is now available on the website, and you can download it through the QR code that you will be able to see on the screen shortly. Thank you again for your attendance, and we wish you all an excellent day.